All right, so we're going to continue on church history, and the back presenter doesn't work if you guys want to turn it on. So we're going through the church history, and we started talking about last time about the Second Crusade, and talked about how the crusade, there was a siege and it was a failure crusade, and then we talked about also the Third Crusade, and this is where it was a stalemate. Pretty much two great people from the West and from the Muslim leaders were good leaders, and they were fighting. And this is pretty much the iconic crusade that people really look at to, and that's how they define crusades. And then we ended with the Fourth Crusade, which was very destructive for the relations between the West and the East. If you remember, we talked about the schism that happened between the Orthodox and the Catholic. So pretty much going through the church history, we're in the medieval times, and we're focusing today on the Black Death. So when we talk about the Black Death, there's also a similar plague that happened, it's called the Justinian plague. This is after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, and this happened around 541 AD. And so there was a great plague that hit Constantinople, and many people died. And this is the same plague that came to the West hundreds of years later. And this was known as the Black Death, or some call it the Black Plague, or some others call it the bubonic plague. And so prior to the Black Death that happened, there was, the population started to grow. There's a population boom. People were going into cities to escape from feudalism. We talk about feudalism. Feudalism is when there's knights that protect the peasants work for the knights, and that is the feudal system. And so people tried to escape the feudal system. They wanted to be independent, free, so they went to cities. Cities started to grow, and because of the population boom and people gathering massively in cities, there's also famines that started happening because the demand was really high. So famines started happening. There's also inflation. Money became inflated, and right before all this was happening, it was the global warming. So if you know anything about the Earth, there's global warming, global cooling, global warming. So right now we're in a global warming state, and that's what we hear in politics all the time. But back then, the High Middle Ages, that's when it was global warming, and now it just started to be global cooling. So at this point, right before the plague hit, it started to go global cooling, and so the winters became colder and everything became colder. And so the plague hit just at the right time, because famine started happening, people were malnourished, and this reduced their immune system, so they're weaker, and then also colder winters. And so the plague was very susceptible to the people. And a lot of people received the disease, and a lot of people died, and the plague spread like wildfire throughout Europe. So the way the plague came, it came from Mongolia, Asia, or China, that area. And when it came through to Asia Minor, which is the area of Turkey and Israel and that area, and then it came to Europe. And this was done through trade, through merchant ships. And the way the plague was spread was through fleas. The fleas, they had the plague on them. The plague did not affect the fleas itself, but the hosts on whom the fleas fed on, they were affected by the plague. So the animals that they bit or the humans that they bit, they became infected by that plague. So the fleas were immune, but the ones they bit, they were not immune, and they got sick. So it was spread through fleas, and there was 3 different types of plagues. So one is called the bubonic plague. This is when they had swells on their bodies. This is where the swells appeared, and a person was in severe agony for several days, intense agony and vomiting as well, and eventually the person died. So that's the one form. The second form is the pneumotic plague. This affects the lungs. So a person started to cough a lot, and it was nearly as painful as the bubonic plague. And also, as the bubonic plague, people that received it also eventually died. And then the third form of it was it's called the septicemic plague, and this is the one that it attacks the blood, and oftentimes people, it was very intense and very painful as well, and people consider this as the most merciful of those plagues because the other ones, it lasted for days. This one only lasted for hours. So the person received this disease and he died the same day, a few hours later. So a little comparison of how these plagues were affected on the population, the fatality rate. So if we look at the bubonic plague, it was, if it was untreated, 50 to 70% chance of dying. If it was treated, 10 to 15% of dying. Pneumotic plague, the ones that affects the lungs, it was 100% chance of dying, no matter if you treated it or not. So that was a very dangerous one. And then the one that affected the blood, it was also almost 100% percentage of dying, or if it was treated, it was 40%. So if we compare it to COVID-19 that's happening right now, it varies from age to age, but it's about 0.5% to 1% chance of dying. So it is nowhere as near as devastating as the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague, or the Black Plague, it killed many people in Europe, and about half of the population died off because of it. So this is the death toll. About 450 to 500 million people died worldwide. And in Europe alone, there's 20 to 50 million people that died from this plague. So this is 30% to 60% of the population. So it is a huge amount of people. So if you take this church, for example, let's say we have about 700 members, plus children, let's say about 1,000. So if 30% to 60% dies, let's just say half of it is 500 members of this church die. So that is a huge amount if you just compare it to our small numbers, but this is on a mass scale. And this plague, it lingers all the way up to 1890s, and so it went through the Reformation. So this plague was still lingering around during the Reformation as well. And so this plague affects the economy. The economy collapses. The peasants wanted freedom, so they were demanded for labor. So it was a really high demand for them, but they saw that this was their advantage to be like, okay, so they need us, so we can put our own standards. But the nobility was even more stricter, so they started to revolt in different areas. And also at this time, this is also at the time of 100 Years' War. So there's just, I'm staging, kind of explaining what's happening during this time. There's also 100 Years' War happening. There's the war between England and France. And it started just 10 years before the plague came. So we see there's a lot of deaths because of war and because of Black Plague. And so what's the reasoning why I'm saying this? How does this affect the church at all? So that's the next point I want to talk about, is how it affected the church. The people started to think, why is the plague coming here? What is the reason for this? And they came to the conclusion as this is the punishment of God upon the people, and people should seek for forgiveness. So there arose groups of people that went around flagellating themselves, started trying to appease God to stop the plague. Because they were thinking, God is punishing us, so we're going to visually show that we are repenting. So they took whips and whipped themselves in the back until they started bleeding and walked down the streets. And this was like kind of like a mob of people walking down the streets, whipping themselves, asking for God to forgive them. And there was a public display of penance or repentance. And also, another thing that happened during this time is people started to purge communities, saying these people are heretics, these people need to be punished, they're troublemakers, and a lot of the Jews were massacred at that time too in Europe. And they blamed the Jews for the spread of the plague. So many thousands of Jews were massacred in those years, and thousands of Jews fled to the eastern part of Europe, so in the Poland area, and that's why in Poland there was a lot of Jews, and because they were seeking refuge away from these mobs that were attacking them. So to continue, we're going to talk about art a little bit. So art changed, so people started to have skeletons in the pictures, skeletons dancing with people, and then so those kind of like morbid type of pictures, because it was just it was affecting society, so the art changed, and also Christian art changed too. So they started to focus more about the death of Jesus. So it was more focused on these kind of sad overtones as the death of Jesus, and kind of that affected the art because of the death, a Black Death. And also another interesting thing, many people say that the song Ring Around the Rosie is also believed to capture the experience of the plague, because the rosy is intended to mean the reddish boils that arose. A pocket full of posies refers to the sweet flowers that the victims carried to mask their scent, because when they had these boils, then they stank. So to cover up that smell, they had these flowers. And then ashes, we all fall down, talking about the death that happens. So this is all that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to talk about the corruption of the papacy next time.